You'll notice on the left-hand side of your screen that you have a stroke palette. Inside this stroke palette, we have the ability to change the type of stroke that we're working with. Currently, I'm working with the dot stroke, which will give us a nice smear of our image across our canvas, giving us a very natural look. If I switch to something like the colorized spray stroke, you notice that I get a very different look. Now we'll talk a lot more about these strokes later on in different tutorials that we work with. Sometimes we'll change the strokes for modeling reasons and sculpting reasons, and sometimes we'll change the stroke for painting or texturing reasons. Now there are a few different areas inside this stroke palette. This first area has to do with 3D and 2.5D strokes that we can use both in sculpting and painting. This second area has to do with only 2.5D strokes that we can work with. And then the third area are a set of modifiers or options that we can use to change for each stroke. Some of these modifiers or options will become grayed out depending on what stroke we're working with. Let's take a look at a stroke used in a 3D sense. So I'm going to open up my tool palette, click on Tool, and select Sphere 3D. I'll hit Ctrl N to clear my canvas. Click and drag to draw that sphere in. Move up here, and again I'm going to hit the Edit key. That'll make my sphere editable. Back in my tool palette, I'm going to click Make Polymesh 3D. That way I can go ahead and sculpt on this sphere. I'll go back into my stroke palette, grab my colorized spray stroke, and then you can see I can apply this stroke directly on the surface of the sphere. If I grab something like the dot rectangle stroke, turn my intensity up, this will allow me to draw and drag my stroke and drop it down wherever I want. So I'll let go of the mouse or pick up my pen, and then that's where I've dropped that stroke. And then I can drop in a few more. You notice underneath stroke we have this option called alpha. Alpha defines the shape of the brush or the stroke that we're working with. So for instance, I was working with this round soft alpha, which gave me a very round soft brush. Let's go back to 2.5D. Again, I'm going to hit Edit, drop this to canvas, and then hit Ctrl N. I'm going to take my stroke and put it back to my dot stroke. And again, as you notice, my alpha is this soft round alpha, which will give me a soft round stroke. Let's Ctrl Z to undo that. Go back to our tool palette and make sure we're on our simple brush, because as you'll notice I was still on the sphere I was working with. So click on simple brush, change our stroke back to dot stroke, and then we're back to our default stroke. So let's switch up our alpha. Choose something like maybe this arrow. If I click, you'll notice I get an arrow right away in my screen here. But if I click and drag, I'm going to smear that across, which can cause for some interesting textures and background. But let's say I want to just see the arrow. I'll Ctrl Z to undo that, go back to my stroke, and then click on the drag rectangle. This way I can drag and draw this arrow into my canvas. Let me turn up Z intensity so we can see that a little bit better. Click and drag, click and drag. That way I can draw the shape of this alpha in. Ctrl Z or Ctrl N to clear the whole canvas. Back in my stroke palette, I might select something like a radial stroke down here in my 2.5D painting options. That way I can draw in multiple arrows at the same time. Let's switch our alpha again. This time I'll choose kind of this swirly looking pattern. I'll go over to my spray stroke, and then I can spray in a bunch of those. Or again, we can pick something like the drag rectangle and draw that in. Ctrl N to clear. Let's take a look at this one more time on a 3D object. So again, I'll go up to my tool palette, open that up, click on a sphere 3D, draw that in. This time I'm going to hit the letter T, which is my keyboard shortcut for edit, so that I can rotate that sphere. And then again in my tool palette, I'm going to click on Make Polymesh 3D. Let's divide this sphere a few times. So I'm going to hit Control D once, Control D twice. I'm going to go back over to my stroke palette, click on Drag Rectangle, go back to my alpha palette, and then let's choose something like this star. Make sure I have a good amount of intensity. I'm going to click and drag that star in. Maybe that's a little too much in intensity, so I'll hit Control Z to undo, take my intensity down a little bit, click and drag to get that star onto the sphere. Now if you want to have a little bit more interactivity when you place that, again you can switch from the drag rectangle over to the drag dot. This will allow me to drag it along the surface and then drop it where I want. Now you notice this second star was a lot smaller than this first one. That's because the drag rectangle allows me to click and drag a star of any size in along this surface. The drag dot, however, is going to be defined by your draw size. So you have to determine your draw size before you start. So I'll turn this up a bit, drag this star along the surface, and then let go to place it wherever I want. So you can add in multiple stars. So when you're practicing with ZBrush, I suggest that you go through your stroke palette, your alpha palette, and you work with this both in a 3D sense and a 2.5D sense. So I'll hit T to drop this sphere to the canvas, and then Control N to clear that. That way I can work on it in both 2.5D and 3D. Just get in here and practice with multiple strokes and multiple alphas. Be aware that in your alpha palette you can actually import your own 2D black and white image to use as your own alpha.